Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm gonna do something that I've never done before on this channel. I'm gonna react to the biblical family tree from Adam to David. And this is from a channel I never watched from before. But I mean, it looks very interesting. It's from UsefulCharts, right? So I think he makes these charts, like prints them out and you can buy them. So that's pretty cool. And I'm also very interested in like how families are connected and how people are connected through heritage, right? It's pretty cool. Like most monarchs are somehow connected to Charlemagne in Europe, right? That's just cool. I don't know why, right? And a lot of people can trace their heritage back to Charlemagne, right? That is pretty cool. Personally, I don't know my own heritage, like my ancestors. I don't know. I have never searched that up, but it would be cool to see that, right? All right, but original videos down below. Let's go.
Today, I'm going to show you the family tree of the Bible from Adam and Eve to King David. I'll be using my brand new biblical family tree chart, which can be purchased as a poster from my website, UsefulCharts.com.
Wow.
Keep in mind that the sections we'll be looking at today, which are the ones at the top of the chart, are considered by most historians to fall into the category of myth and legend. Whereas the sections at the bottom of the chart, which I've already covered in separate videos, are considered to be primarily historical. If you're curious to learn more about the terms mythology, legend, and history, and how they apply to the various parts of the Bible, you'll definitely want to check out part 1 in my series on biblical genealogy. You can find a link to that video, as well as all of the videos in this series, in the description.
One thing though, it makes sense why some parts from Adam at least are myth, legend. It's written down in a Bible, yes, but you can't really trace it back, sort of, right? Technically you can trace it back to two people, all humans that live on Earth. You can trace them back. I don't know if it's through the female line or male line, but you can trace every human back to two specific people that were human, I think. The first humans, I think it is. Or at least we know about the woman. That's the first woman. And everybody is descendant of her. Something like that. And maybe she is Eve. And I think people call her Eve. That woman. I think so. Okay. This will be very interesting. It's a very cool concept.
According to the book of Genesis, the first two humans were named Adam and Eve, and they were created directly by God. Now, according to modern DNA research, all humans alive today can in fact be traced back to a single male ancestor, which scientists have cleverly named Y chromosomal Adam, and a single female ancestor named mitochondrial Eve. But
he's gonna say something else, but yeah, that's what I meant. So I was right. So you can trace also to Adam. But
But keep in mind that these two DNA ancestors are very different from the Adam and Eve from the biblical story. For one thing, Y chromosomal Adam probably did not live at the same time as mitochondrial Eve. And even if, by some strange coincidence, the science showed that they did live at the exact same time, they were likely not a couple. And they certainly would not have been the only two Homo sapiens on Earth. Instead, they were simply the male whose Y chromosomal DNA ended up beating out everyone else's, and the female whose mitochondrial DNA ended up beating out everyone else's.
Exactly, because the world doesn't work in a vacuum, right? It's not that the first ever human, Homo sapien, was born, and then from that Homo sapien, every other Homo sapien comes from, right? It's just that that line is one that survived, that we can trace back. Right? Okay. That's good information.
I hope to cover the science behind all of this in a separate video sometime next year. But back to the Bible. Yep. According to the biblical account, Adam and Eve were a couple, and initially the only two humans on Earth. Yep. Eventually, though, after getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they had two sons named Cain and Abel.
Was it on Earth? It was paradise, but was it on Earth? Maybe. Someone let me know in the comments. I don't know. I'm a little rusty here, but I don't know if it's on Earth, but they're on paradise. I don't know if Earth is paradise before they sinned, but okay.
Cain was a farmer, and Abel was a shepherd. But one day, Cain ended up killing his brother Abel out of jealousy. Now, considering that the Israelites were originally pastoralists, like the good son Abel was, this story may actually have a basis in some sort of historical conflict between the Israelites and some nearby agriculturalists. Yes. But as I explained in the earlier video in this series, the biblical writers were more interested in making theological points than they were about simply recording exact historical details. Exactly.
It's same with the Greeks, same with the Persians, same with the Romans, right? Their gods, yes, they believe in the gods, but also the stories that they tell of the gods, or Hercules or Heracles, is more of, like I said before, like the Bible, it's a way of living life and looking at life and how you're experiencing life, but somewhat over-exaggerating life itself and trying to explain it, not through saying like a stone weighs 10 grams and that's why it's a stone, right? Like, you're not saying just factual things, you're trying to explain it from a point of view of looking at life. Interesting.
Anyway, Adam and Eve went on to have a third son named Seth, as well as a bunch of other children. It is from Seth's line that we eventually get the next major character in the Bible, Noah. Yes. But before I go on, I want to point out that both Cain's line and Seth's line are recorded in the Bible and that they have some interesting similarities. Both contain a series of 6 names that are almost identical, except for one small swap and several alternate spellings. So one possibility is that both genealogies share a common origin. In other words, maybe there was originally one list of ancestors that was passed down orally, but over the centuries, people in one area remembered the names in a slightly different way, and eventually it developed into a parallel tradition. Then, at some later point, editors combined the two traditions and made it seem like they were separate genealogies. This is not the only example of parallel accounts in the first 5 books of the Bible. In fact, there are lots of them, indicating that these books were pieced together from multiple sources and tradition. Again, this is a topic that I hope to cover in a separate video sometime next year. For now, let's return to the family tree. Noah is the guy who built the large boat called the Ark and filled it with a bunch of animals. This is because God decided to destroy the earth in a flood and then start all over again with Noah and his family, who were the only survivors. Now, as many commenters pointed out in previous videos, flood stories are a common theme found in cultures throughout the world.
It is.
This seems to indicate...
So that's, again, the flood, like you said, is common throughout different cultures around the world, right? So you could argue, because it's different sources saying the same thing at, like, around the world, not even talking to each other or communicating. So either they could communicate maybe with each other somehow, I don't know, or it was true that it was a flood, right? Something like that. Or we have our history of human migration wrong, right? Maybe people migrated later on than we think, right? To like the Americas. And also one thing about the flood, you can contrast that with the stories of dragons, right? Because you hear stories of dragons in China. You hear them in England/Wales, right? With King Arthur and Sir Lancelot, right? The Round Table. You hear them in North Africa, right? So I don't know what that is. I don't know if there was maybe like a lizard thing that looked like a dragon or something. I don't know. These are interesting things and we don't know them, right? We don't know why different cultures at different places on the earth talked about a flood. Same with the dragon, right? It's just interesting.
Indicate that there may have been some sort of major flood event that was retained in humanity's collective memory. Or
because one thing he said, like oral tradition, meaning that you say like stories and talk about the things that has happened, and that easily can get spun. It's like the game Chinese Whispers, right? You tell someone something and the next person tells the next person and you keep going and then the stories change. But oral tradition is also a great way of keeping some parts of the story true and the story alive. If you write it down and let's say you store it in a place, maybe the Library of Alexandria, maybe someone burns it down and then you don't have the historical records, right? Because, I mean, if you compare the oral tradition to the written tradition, the oral tradition we have had it for thousands of years of stories, right? Great tales, historical events, right?
Perhaps there was just a bunch of smaller events.
Maybe.
You'll notice that on this chart, there are two timelines. On the left, there is one based on the biblical account. And on the right, there is one based on the secular account, using the information that has been gleaned from science and archaeology. So you can take your pick as to which one you want to follow. But either way, it's interesting to compare the two. For example, on the secular timeline, I've noted that around the year 2900 BCE, there was a devastating yet localized flood in Sumer, and that this is the most likely candidate for the event that inspired the various Middle Eastern flood myths.
Maybe.
According to the Bible, Noah had 3 sons, and therefore everyone alive on earth today would be a descendant of either Shem, Ham, or Japheth.
Yep.
This is where the idea of there being 3 distinct human races comes from.
Yep.
Usually named white, black, and yellow.
But then that doesn't make sense because Noah is just the guy, so everybody's just descended from Noah somehow, right? So again though, this is from the biblical text, so you can see that they're not saying people who are descended from Shem are this color and Ham and Japheth from this color, right? They're saying maybe people descended lived here, maybe people descended from Ham lived here and Japheth here, right? But that doesn't mean that it has to be that, right? It's theological, right?
But let me emphasize strongly, this idea is not true. Modern
exactly, it's not true. Or I mean, it could be sort of true that you're descended from Shem but not Ham and Japheth. That could make sense. But again, you're all related because everybody's related to Noah, right? So it's not true, but if it was true, it would have still been, it still wouldn't matter because you all are related to Noah, right?
DNA research shows us that we can divide people into hundreds of different ethnicities based on regional genetic variation.
Yep.
But there is no genetic marker that allows us to then take those ethnicities and group them together into just a handful of categories called races.
Yeah.
The closest thing would be to group ethnicities by continent, But even there, the categories would overlap quite a bit.
Exactly.
And they would not line up very nicely with continental lines. But the authors of the Bible did not have knowledge of DNA or historical migration patterns.
But I don't think that matters, though. Because even if they didn't have that knowledge, they are saying here, okay, people from this part of the world are from Shem, this part of the world from Ham, and this from Japheth. But again, all these three brothers are related to Noah because Noah is the father. So everybody is related still, right? So it doesn't matter because they don't have to say we're all related. They are just showing you, oh, Noah is the father, then the rest doesn't matter that they're split because everybody's related to Noah. But I understand what he's saying.
So according to them, the various nations of the earth that they were familiar with could in fact be explained using a simple family tree. And that's what the next part of the biblical family tree is. A family tree of nations. Shem had 5 sons, Ham had 4, and Japheth had 7. So in total, Noah had 16 grandsons. In most cases, the names of those 16 grandsons match perfectly with the names of nations that existed in the Middle East during the time when the Bible was written. So on this map are 5 sons of Shem, shown in red, 4 sons of Ham, shown in yellow, and 7 sons of Japheth, shown in blue. Let's look at Ham first. From this map, it's clear that Ham was primarily associated with Africa. In fact, up until recently, the term Hamitic was still used to refer to language groups from North Africa. Nowadays, the term Afro-Asiatic is used instead. The most important Hamitic nation was Mitzrayim. This was and is the Hebrew word for Egypt, but it was also the ancient Babylonian word for Egypt.
Makes sense.
So keep in mind that most of these names are not the names of people. They are quite clearly place names. Canaan.
Which makes sense, right? But also the places, it's sort of this paradox, sort of, right? Because, okay, it's not the name of the people, but the places. But where did the places get their name? Maybe like Native Americans did in the US, maybe from what they saw with their eyes. Right, they saw a creek and they called a creek with their own language, and that's the place now in the US or something like that, right? Or a mountain, or a white mountain, black mountain, right? Or an old tree, right? But also, is it that the place got a name from the people saying that their surrounding looked like this, and then the people named themselves after the place, right? Or is it that the people called themselves that because they lived there, and then they called the place where they lived what they called themselves? I don't know. It sounds very problematic, but okay.
And Cush being 2 more good examples.
Yep.
Turning our attention to the red section representing the descendants of Shem, there are also several recognizable place names here too. Aram being an ancient name for Syria, Asher being an alternate name for Assyria, and Elam being a nation that existed on the Iranian plateau prior to the rise of Persia. The only one that stands out as being a personal name rather than a place name is Arphaxad, which, as we'll see, is the person from whom Abraham, from Ur of the Chaldeans, descended. I should also point out that it is from the name Shem, ancestor of all these red areas, that we get the term Semitic and anti-Semitic.
Makes sense.
Finally, let's talk about Japheth, shown in blue. These names are more obscure and uncertain, as they are all names given to places much farther away from the land of Israel. Javan is usually associated with the Greeks, and Madai with the Medes. But when it comes to the other 5, it's mostly guesswork. During the medieval period, it was thought that some of these nations, in particular Gomer, spread into Europe. If we return to the family tree chart, you'll notice that Gomer had a grandson named Ashkenaz, who was thought to be the ancestor of the Germans. It is for this reason that Jews who lived in Germany and then migrated to Eastern Europe came to be called Ashkenazi Jews. So when it comes to the three sons of Noah, very roughly you could say that Ham represented Africa, Shem represented West Asia, and Japheth represented Europe. And
but the middle of all those three parts is Israel, right? Not like what he has shown, but the middle of them three is Israel, because that's where they migrated from. Makes sense.
And this is exactly what certain medieval Christian thinkers promoted, which in turn led to the idea.
Although, though, what I'm saying, that didn't make sense. Although, again, this makes sense. Three different parts. But they're all three interlinked because their grandfather was Noah. Or their father, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Their father was Noah. So they're all interlinked.
Idea of three races, which unfortunately was used to promote a heck of a lot of racism. But we don't need modern DNA research to conclude that the classification system offered by the Bible is, at the very least, incomplete. You'll notice that the people living in India, China, Australia, the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, etc., were not included in this classification system. That's simply because the biblical writers weren't aware that those people even existed. What they were doing was simply painting a picture of the world as they knew it. Okay, let's continue down the tree. Arphaxad had a grandson named Eber, and this is probably where the term Hebrew comes from. From there, if we go down another 5 generations, we get a man named Terah, who had 3 sons, Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Of these 3, Abraham was by far the most important. In fact, the book of Genesis is really a book about Abraham, his son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob, together known as the 3 patriarchs. Everything in the Bible that comes before Abraham, like the Adam and Eve story and the flood story, is really just a prologue. Abraham is said to be the father of 3 major world religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it is because of this that these religions are often called the Abrahamic religions. So let's look at his family tree. Abraham was married to his half-sister Sarah. But Sarah had difficulty having children, so Abraham married her handmaid Hagar as well, who was Egyptian, and had a son by her named Ishmael. But as the story goes, God promised that Sarah would miraculously have a child in her old age, and indeed she did, naming the child Isaac. Shortly thereafter, Hagar gets banished and winds up in Arabia, where, according to Islamic tradition, Ishmael became the ancestor of the northern Arabic tribes. A lot of people forget this, but Abraham actually had a 3rd wife as well, named Keturah. According to the Bible, the people who later became the Midianites are the descendants of Abraham's son named Midian from his marriage to Keturah.
But that makes sense because Abraham was the first patriarch, so that makes sense that everything that follows is sort of linked to Abraham, right? It makes sense.
One last thing to mention about Abraham. It is curious that the name Abraham is comprised of the exact same consonants as the name of the Hindu god Brahma, who is the father of several other important Hindu gods, and who happens to have a wife named Saraswati. So maybe the 2 oldest religions on the planet, Judaism and Hinduism, both have links to a similar, even earlier tradition that includes a couple named something like Braham and Sarah. It's a very big maybe, but it's fun to think about.
But that is one thing that, because he criticized sort of, which makes sense, that the Bible only wrote about, or the things that were written in the Bible and put in the Bible was only written by the things that the people saw around them and knew was around them. Not the things that happened in the East or the West, or Western Sahara, or Southern Africa, or Australia, or anything like that. But then here we saw a glimpse that they actually maybe knew more, right? Right? Maybe the history goes further back in time than we think. And when people were much closer, when there were less people who were more closer to get together and knew about each other. And then people started migrating away. And then people stopped knowing because they probably didn't teach their children about the things that had happened. And it got lost.
Abraham's son Isaac ended up marrying a relative named Rebekah.
Yep.
She was the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor, thus making Isaac and Rebekah first cousins once removed.
Yep.
Together, they had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau was the eldest and therefore entitled to the main inheritance. But through trickery, Jacob managed to get Esau to pass his birthright on to him. So Jacob becomes the next big character in the story. He falls in love with his cousin Rachel. You can see here that her father Laban was Rebekah's brother, but Laban tricks him into marrying his other daughter, Leah, instead. In the end, he ends up marrying both sisters, but has to work for Laban for 20 years. In total, Jacob, whose name is later changed to Israel, has 12 sons and 1 daughter named Dinah. The 12 sons eventually end up becoming the 12 tribes of Israel. But before we move on, let's quickly look at a map of the biblical land of Israel. To the east, in what is today Jordan, there were 3 nations that were on and off enemies of the Israelites: Ammon, Moab, and Edom. Well, according to the Bible, these 3 nations were actually relatives of the Israelites.
Which makes sense.
The Moabites and Ammonites were the descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot, and the Edomites were the descendants of Jacob's older brother Esau. Okay, the 12 tribes of Israel. Out of the 12, there are 2 that are the most important. Levi, from which the priestly line comes, shown in red, and Judah, from which the royal line comes, shown in blue. Now, the other tribes are shown in yellow, and if you count them, you'll notice that there are actually 11, meaning that in total we actually have 13 tribes, not 12. Let me explain. Jacob's most famous son was Joseph, who was given the multicolored coat, but wound up being sold to Egypt, where he became advisor to the Pharaoh. He was the firstborn son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, so he was given a double portion in terms of inheritance. Therefore, the tribe of Joseph is usually split into 2 tribes based on his 2 sons,
that makes sense.
Ephraim and Manasseh. And since the tribe of Levi were appointed to be priests, they didn't get any physical inheritance. So once we take them out, we're back to 12. Anyway, Jacob and his family ended up moving to Egypt, where Joseph was living, and it is there that they grew into a nation. But as the story goes, after a few generations, the Egyptians forced them to become slaves, which brings us to the Exodus story and the story of Moses, the most important prophet in Judaism. According to the 2nd book of the Bible, called Exodus, Moses was placed in the Nile River as a baby and then discovered by one of the Pharaoh's daughters.
Just one thing. The Disney movie about this is pretty good, I think. Yeah, I haven't seen this one. I think this is old, like from the 40s and 50s maybe. But the animated from Disney is pretty good. Just a little thing.
Adopted him and raised him as her own. But as an adult, he sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite and kills the perpetrator. He then escapes to Midian to avoid punishment, where he meets Jethro and marries Jethro's daughter, Zipporah. It is in Midian that God appears to Moses in the form of a burning bush and tells him that he has to go lead his people out of Egypt and into the Promised Land,
Yep.
which was back where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had lived. Moses gets help from his brother Aaron, and after God gives Egypt a series of 10 plagues, Pharaoh eventually lets the Israelites go. Although, as the story goes, the Pharaoh then changes his mind and traps the Israelites near the Red Sea,
Yep.
where God then performs a great miracle, causing the sea to part and the Israelites to escape for good.
Yep.
They end up wandering in the desert for 40 years, though, at the end of which Moses passes on the torch to a man named Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim, who then leads the Israelites to conquer the land of Canaan, where they end up dividing the land amongst the 12 tribes, with the descendants of Aaron being appointed as priests.
Okay.
Now, as I mentioned in part 1 of this series, according to secular historians, the leading theory is that the Israelites were actually just one of the many Canaanite tribes, and that they never did live in Egypt as a nation.
Maybe.
Not in the main part of Egypt anyway. During this period, Canaan was actually a part of the Egyptian Empire.
Yep.
So it's possible that some of them were in fact Egyptian slaves, and that they were somehow able to throw off that yoke of slavery. But
what exactly? They could have been slaves, but one thing that people question is that were they the slaves that built the pyramids? And that's probably no, right? Because they didn't live at the same time. That's a probably no. But I don't think the Bible says that the Israelites built the pyramids, right? It's just that they were slaves in Egypt. Right? Okay.
In Canaan, not in Egypt. The exact details are not known, but this is yet another topic that I hope to come back to and explore in more detail at a later date.
Makes sense.
According to the biblical account, the period between the conquest of Canaan and the rise of the Davidic monarchy was a period in which the Israelites were ruled by a series of military leaders called judges. Among these judges are several famous Bible characters, such as Samson, Gideon, and the female judge, Deborah. Deborah is important because, according to biblical scholars, a portion of the book of Judges, called the Song of Deborah, is thought to be the oldest layer of text in the entire Bible.
Wow.
The last major character before the monarchical period is the prophet Samuel, who was a Levite. It was Samuel who initially appointed Saul to be king, and then later David.
Okay.
David is followed by his son Solomon, and then after Solomon, the Israelites split into 2 major kingdoms, the kingdom of Judah in the south and the kingdom of Israel in the north. Judah, of course, was mostly comprised of the tribe of Judah, whereas Israel was comprised of all the remaining tribes.
Makes sense.
If you want to see the rest of the tree, you can check out my video on the kings of ancient Israel and Judah, which I've already posted and which you can find a link to in the description. But before I go, let me explain one more thing. It is said that there were 10 northern tribes, but who exactly those 10 tribes were sometimes differ.
Okay.
There are actually 3 different ways we can come up with the number 10. One way is to leave the Levites to the side, as I've suggested earlier, and to count the tribe of Benjamin as part of the kingdom of Judah, because their allotment of land was very close to Judah's, and they were usually thought of as being on the Judah side of the border. But another way is to include Simeon with Judah instead. This is because, according to the Bible, Simeon, like Levi, was not given a separate land allotment. And this was because of a special punishment that was given to those 2 brothers, which is mentioned back in Genesis 34. But a third way is to go ahead and count Levi, but to combine Ephraim and Manasseh back together as the tribe of Joseph. This is the way that Jews usually count the 12 tribes, as evidenced by these stamps from the modern state of Israel. But no matter which way you divide the tribes, again, you usually end up with 10 that are considered to have made up the northern tribes. And this has led to all sorts of speculation and pseudo-historical theories.
Okay.
You see, as I mentioned in the next part in this series, the northern kingdom gets destroyed first, leaving only Judah behind, where the people become known as Jews. So some people like to talk about the so-called lost 10 tribes of Israel, who are supposedly distinct from the Jews and about whom there are all kinds of crazy theories.
Okay.
Once again, I hope to cover that topic at some point next year. Okay, be sure to check out the description for the other parts of this series. And take note that the final part of the series, which will focus on the genealogy of Jesus, is scheduled, very appropriately, for Christmas Day.
Wow,
so
that's cool.
If you're not yet subscribed, make sure you hit the subscribe button now so you don't miss it. Thanks.
Wow, that was pretty cool. That was very insightful as well. Right? And it's just so cool to trace back history like this, right? Ancestry. Even though it might have been sort of wrong, but also it tells a story when you follow the ancestry down, right? Because it is history, obviously. But it tells a story of how the world looked, right? Even though, obviously, the people who weren't spoken about maybe just were normal people and didn't do that much to be talked about, which, you know, yeah. But alright, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.